We're now going to open the floor to questions. As a reminder, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. All the questions will be over the phone. Operator, could you please proceed to our first question?
Thank you, merci. You may press star 1 if you have a question. Vous pouvez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. The first question is from David Youngren from Reuters Ottawa. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Minister, firstly, did the Proud Boys or any of the other groups you've listed today pose a current serious security threat to Canada?
Thank you very much, David, for the question. And frankly, that's I would say absolutely yes. And that's precisely why we have included them as a terrorist entity on our listings under the Criminal Code. There has been a growing body of evidence collected here in Canada and among our international partners, particularly in the United States, of the escalation of violence that this group has been involved in. It is deeply concerning, and you know, although we've been monitoring the activities of this group with considerable concern since 2018, we've seen most recently, and there is a great deal of evidence to support that there has been a serious and concerning escalation of violent, not just rhetoric, but activity and planning, and that's why we have responded as we have today.
Now, I couldn't help noticing that this move came only a week after the House of Commons called unanimously for you to do this. I know you said the move wasn't political, but what would you say to those who might be concerned that you acted quite so quickly after the House called on you to act?
Yeah. I want to be very clear that there really is. I understand the political context and the motivation of some to get out of this and get in front of this issue politically, and certainly the events of January 6th, and you know the great public concern arising from that, not unsurprisingly, did initiate a political response. But this process of listing a group as a terrorist entity cannot be political. It has to be based entirely on evidence, intelligence, and the law. And that's why I tried very carefully to articulate that the work of gathering that evidence and intelligence has been taking place over several months and even years. We work very closely with law enforcement agencies and our national security partners, particularly in the Five Eyes, and in the case of that particular organization, with the United States, we have been monitoring very carefully and gathering evidence that supports the determination and the decision that was made with respect to this. But the decision, I think it's important to recognize that this is a legal decision that has significant legal consequences for those entities and organizations that we list as terrorists. And therefore, it has to be based on a defensible body of evidence that does, in fact, provide me with reasonable and probable grounds to believe that they do meet that threshold. I've gone over that evidence with the Department of Justice and received their advice, which supports my decision. And I'm, I want to take the opportunity to commend the vigilant and excellent work of our national security intelligence agencies and the RCMP and other law enforcement agencies who have been gathering that intelligence and gathering that evidence, and the work that we have done with our Five Eyes partners, particularly law enforcement in the United States and the intelligence organizations in the United States, to come to this determination today. I want to assure Canadians that this has to be a determination based entirely on evidence and the law, and that we've followed that progress rigorously. I understand Canadians' concerned, and I think that's reflected in some of the political discussion that we've witnessed. But that's not the basis of this decision. This decision has to be based on evidence and law.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question est de Mélanie Marquis-La Presse. La parole est à vous.
Thank you very much. And my question is for Mr. Lightbound. Along the same lines, Mr. Singh had called for a designation of the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity. There was a petition. Shortly thereafter, the House unanimously adopted a motion urging the government to take action. How can you reassure Canadians that the process was independent and that there wasn't any pressure? Answer. Thank you for the question. As Bill mentioned, and I'm sorry, I hear the translation, I'll just turn my sound down. It's clear that it did generate attention, and we saw the motion from the NDP in the House recently. But this is a process that predates that type of political interest that we've seen in recent weeks. Our security officials, responsible for national security in this country, must, before an entity is listed, provide evidence, intelligence, proof that is subsequently rigorously analyzed to ensure that it meets the criteria outlined in the criminal code. That's what justifies the addition at the listing of 13 entities today. The same process was used for each of the entities.
Suivi?
Follow-up. Again, with respect to the Proud Boys, inaudible. They said stand back and stand by. You've added them to the list. Could you please comment? I'm not sure if the question is for me or for the minister.
Mélanie, could you repeat your question?
It's for you, Mr. Lightbound. The question is for you. With respect to the Proud Boys, Mr. Trump has said stand back and stand by. Answer. Our analysis is independent of those comments made south of the border. The message that it sends for the Proud Boys and the other 12 is that once an entity is listed, there are legal consequences. The law enforcement agencies can intervene if they're active in Canada. It sends a very clear message that we are monitoring them. They meet the criteria to be listed, and this gives the police forces more power to ensure that there can't be violence on Canadian soil.
Operator, next question.
The next question is from Paul Vieira, Wall Street Journal. Please go ahead.
My questions were answered right off the bat. Thanks.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question est de Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. La parole est à vous.
The next question is for Hélène Buzetti from Le Devoir. Good afternoon. I don't know if you'll answer the question, Mr. Lightbound, or the minister, but one of the consequences of a listing is that financial assets are frozen. Do we have an assessment of the assets for the 13 groups that have been listed today?
I don't know, Minister, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joel. As I'm sure that the journalists can understand, we're dealing with quite an amount of very sensitive intelligence and investigative material here that assists us in making this determination. I'm not able, and neither would it be appropriate, to discuss the detail of that assessment. But let me assure you that our national intelligence security agencies and law enforcement have been very active in the investigations on this file. The financing of terrorist activity and violent extremism forms always part of those investigations, but I'm not able or prepared to share the details of those investigations or that intelligence in this briefing. It's not appropriate, but I want to assure Canadians that our agencies remain vigilant and are working hard with each other and with our international partners in those investigations.
So, Minister, allow me to ask the question differently then. Without revealing how much money each of those organizations have, can you give us a sense or an appreciation of how widespread their network of resources was in Canada? Thank you.
Thank you. And within the limits of the rules with respect to evidence and intelligence that I don't want to breach, there are, for example, a number of ways in which these entities have been able to do fundraising. through crowdfunding and in various means, etc. Those are now going to be severely restricted and constricted. Their ability to raise funds in Canada, and for anyone who continues to provide them with support with respect to travel, with gathering of material, with fundraising, all of those things now can have serious consequences. And so one of the, I think, important effects of listing these entities as terrorist organizations, it creates a number of very effective tools for the financial sector, but also for law enforcement to deal with them more effectively. And it also can create fairly substantial criminal consequences for those who continue to support them.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
The next question is from Alex Boutillier from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Minister, I think a lot of anti-hate and anti-racist organizations are going to be surprised that the Proud Boys actually made the list. They're viewed in Canada somewhat different than they're viewed in the United States, disorganized, small chapters here and there. Can you give us any appreciation of, what has changed in the agency's assessments, whether they be, more organized or small groups, that look to be more violent? Can you give us any sense of what has changed in that group status?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. I think it's a really important question because, I think, there are a number of different ideologically motivated extremist groups that are online and that have not met this threshold. We have been monitoring the activities of that particular group for some period of time. What I can tell you is over the past several months, basically since 2018, we have seen an escalation, and there is, an escalation towards violence for this group. And I will also tell you, we look at this organization in its totality. And although, as you've indicated, and I agree, that there are Canadian chapters of this organization across the country, but there's also a strong affiliation with the broader organization, which is also very active in the United States. I think it's important to acknowledge as well that in the aftermath of the U.S. presidential election, we've seen an escalation in supports that signal an escalation towards violence for a number of different groups, including the Proud Boys. We've also seen acts in furtherance of that rhetoric and that those supports towards violence, in that people have actually gone out and engaged, acquired weapons, and engaged in activities which are now subject to criminal investigation and charges forthcoming in the United States, which also I think strongly supports the growing concern around the activities of this group. I also want to acknowledge, and I've listened very carefully to those organizations who are concerned about the impact on free speech and freedom of association, and as violent and as repugnant as the rhetoric and the ideologies of these hateful organizations might be, it's important to acknowledge that there is a threshold beyond which that it's no longer about speech, it's about violence, and it's about extremism, and it's about terror. And in my opinion, based on the totality of evidence that our national security intelligence organizations and law enforcement have gathered, also what we have obtained from our international Five Eyes partners, particularly from the United States, I think provides us with an overwhelming preponderance of evidence that the activities of that organization now meets the threshold of a terrorist entity, and that's why we've listed it.
Great. And just on a slightly different topic, the Privacy Commissioner said today that Clearview AI, which has been used by several law enforcement agencies in Canada, including the RCMP, their operations were not only illegal, it amounted to mass surveillance on Canadians. Back when these stories started breaking, you said that you had not issued any directives to police or law enforcement agencies concerning the use of facial recognition technology. Have you done so since, or are you considering doing so now that the Privacy Commissioner has deemed that the activity is illegal mass surveillance?
Well, I think the advice and the findings of the Privacy Commissioner are very important to this discussion, and I very much value the excellent work that the Privacy Commissioner has done. I also very much value his advice and his collaboration in developing appropriate protocols and safeguards for the use of any emerging technology, so that we think that many new technologies can be important in providing safeguards and safety for Canadians, but at the same time they have to be done in such a way which is respectful of Canadians' privacy rights. I know that there were circumstances where the RCMP briefly used this software. They stopped immediately, and I know there's an investigation being done by the Privacy Commissioner. But we also, I want to state how important his advice and collaboration will be in developing appropriate safeguards and protocols for the use of all emergency technologies in this regard, and we'll continue to work with him to ensure Canadians' privacy interests are protected.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
La prochaine question de Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. La parole
The next question is from Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. Good afternoon. My question is for Mr. Lightbound. Minister Blair made some comments, but I'd like you to elaborate on the role that the election in the United States played, the presidential election, in the decision today. Was it a factor? Did those events play a role in increasing the threat? I'd like to know just to what extent it was a factor in today's decision. Answer. Thank you, Mr. Blouin, for the question. I apologize. I'm receiving the English translation at the same time. I may have missed something, but it's not the election as such that played a role in the determination of these listings. When we think about the Proud Boys, these are groups that our agencies have been monitoring for some time now, for several years in some cases. The events that we witnessed on the 6th of January in the United States enabled us to gather additional information and intelligence, and that has led us to making the determination along with the intelligence accumulated here by our agencies. From a legal perspective, the criteria are now met to list this organization and designate it as a terrorist one. Question. Canada became the first country to designate the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity. Why is it important for Canada to be the first country to do so? Answer. I don't think it's important for Canada to be the first country to do so. We don't operate based on who has taken action before or who takes action after us. It's based on information gathered by our intelligence agencies. It's then an analysis to ensure that the criteria are met. This analysis has been underway for years, the past few years. And it has now been justified that it is a listable entity.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
The next question is from Libertium from Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This question is for Minister Blair. I'm just curious as to the use of the term, the IMDE acronym, if you will. Wondering why aren't we labeling these? Why isn't the government labeling these organizations, white supremacist groups, right-wing organizations, that type of thing? Why the use of this term to describe these organizations?
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's an important question. Listen, hate knows no bounds, and unfortunately, and although the group that we refer to today has demonstrated white supremacist, racist, Islamophobic, homophobic, and misogynist attitudes, all ideologically motivated extremism when it crosses the threshold of violence. Therefore, the acronym of IMVW, I think, is an all-encompassing and accurate reflection of growing concern about the activities of these groups that are motivated by ideology. So it's not just politics, it's not just right or left, and it's not particular to any particular religious background or bias or hatred, but rather in totality. The ideologically motivated violent extremism of these groups is what is deeply concerning. And I would point, for example, the other groups that we have listed today that also meet that definition, the Ottawaffen division which is a neo-Nazi terror group. Most of their hatred is anti-Semitic. and deeply concerning to us. The Russian imperial movement has a political element, but is also ideologically driven, and the base also a neo-Nazi organization, nihilistic and accelerationist in their rhetoric. The group, the title of ideologically motivated violent extremists, I think is a useful one. It is all encompassing for those groups. It isn't about their bias. It isn't about their speech. It is about their violent extremism and their willingness to escalate and use violence in the furtherance of their aims and advancement of their ideologies. That's why we use the term. I think it's an appropriate one, and it doesn't limit us, but it also I think is useful in that there's a number of different motivations that can lead to violent extremism, and the definition and the intelligence gathering that we use enables us to gather that information appropriately for all such groups.
Thank you. And a number of NGOs, civil society groups, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group in particular, is welcoming the fact that the government is taking action against hate groups, but it has raised concerns about the use of the terror list and the fact that it exists, suggests that it is actually a threat to Canadians' rights, and that there should be other avenues, if you will, taken to address these groups and tackle them that would better protect Canadians' rights. How would you respond to those criticisms?
Yeah, I first of all, I want to assure them that I understand their concern. I've listened very carefully to their concerns. I've had a number of conversations just this morning with them, and to provide them with assurance that the decisions that the government of Canada has reached and announced today is in fact based on evidence. It's based on intelligence, and it's based on that legal threshold, that very important legal threshold that must be met. I also understand the concern. This isn't about a particular set of beliefs, or even the various hateful speech that presents itself online. There are other tools available to us to deal with appropriately such behaviors and such beliefs. But having said all that, the use of the terrorist entity listing has some significant legal consequences as well. It's one of the reasons it has to be done so carefully. It's one of the reasons it can't be a political decision. It has to really be one based on strong input from our cross government collaboration of our agencies, particularly in the national security intelligence field, in law enforcement, and at the Department of Justice, because it is a determination that has significant legal consequences. I understand the concern that is expressed. I want to assure those who very much care about civil liberties that our government does too. And it is our intent to always stand up for Canadians' constitutional rights, to uphold our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to protect Canadians' civil liberties. And at the same time, for those individuals or organizations that cross a very important but significant threshold of violent extremism that begins in an escalation and the use of violence, advocating for the killing of religious minorities, of women, of members of the LGBT community. For those types of behaviors, there has to be a strong response. I also want to assure you that the listing of these individuals and organizations as terrorist entities doesn't stop the work. It's another tool, but it's also we have other tools available to us within the criminal code, with a number of other measures that we are able to take. I've indicated some of them: the financial and limitations of travel and support for these organizations. We'll use all the tools in the toolbox to keep Canadians safe, but we will always do it mindful of our responsibilities to uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Canadian liberties.
Thank you. As a reminder, we've got about 10 minutes left now, so we'll continue with the next question over the phone.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question est de Anne-Caroline Desplanques, Le Journal de Montréal. La parole est à vous.
The next question is from Le Journal de Montréal.
Bonjour, merci de prendre ma question.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking my question.
M'entendez-vous?
Can you hear me?
Oui.
Yes.
Alors, ma question revient, je reviens, c'était posé, mais
My question has already been asked, but I would like to go back to the answer about criteria. What criteria, or why do the Proud Boys now meet the criteria?
ne répondent pas encore aux critères.
And there are other groups, similar groups that don't meet the criteria.
Minister, do you want to answer?
Now, I apologize, Joelle. I did not get a translation of the question, and so I'd ask if you would respond.
Sure. I can ask in English if it's better. I'd like to know what exactly the criteria, why the Proud Boys is now classified and responds to the criminal code criteria, and not the Boogaloo Boys, for example, or other groups that were recently involved in violent acts and kidnapping and other things in the U.S., for example.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I appreciate the opportunity to provide clarity. We have been gathering evidence and intelligence on a number of different organizations who have been involved in some of these activities, and I think came to very prominent public attention over the past several months, particularly in activities in the United States, but they are also of concern to us. Those organizations clearly are also hateful organizations motivated by intolerance and hatred. There is evidence that they have engaged in some violent activity as well. I want to assure you and assure Canadians that the work is ongoing. We continue to work with our Five Eyes partners and our national security intelligence agencies and law enforcement continue to gather the evidence and intelligence, and there is an ongoing process of evaluation and review of that evidence when it meets the threshold. I don't disagree that some of these groups are in fact quite odious and their activities and their rhetoric is vile. We will continue to do the work and the process. I think it's also important to explain the process of terrorist listings. It's not an annual activity, it's an evergreen process. And so as we gather that intelligence and as an assessment and determination is made that the intelligence and evidence may meet the threshold for any particular group to be included on this list as a terrorist entity, we'll bring that information forward. The work is ongoing, but what we've announced today is the culmination of the work to date, and there's more to do.
Thank you.
Thank
Follow
you,
up?
Minister. Yes, thank you for your response. It's much better and much clearer now. My other question is regarding what is done with the members of these entities to ensure that they are actually not involved in other activities with other groups or that they create new groups, for example.
Yes, ma'am, and I think that's a reasonable concern that many may have. We have seen a number of these very hateful individuals who move from group to group. We've seen a number of groups that have offshot from others. And for example, today we listed both the base and the Proud Boys, and there is some evidence that some of the individuals who are involved with the base had earlier origins in other groups, including the Proud Boys. And so it is important that there be an ongoing commitment to the gathering of intelligence and the evaluation of an assessment and analysis of that intelligence and evidence so that we keep careful track of these individuals. Just because they change their T-shirt or the patch that they're wearing on the shoulder doesn't really change the true nature of these terrorist groups. And so it's an ongoing process. And when we see some individuals maybe breaking off and forming a more concerning group, as is quite often the case, then we'll continue to focus on that. Like even within some of the entities we've identified, there are individuals, Canadians, who are sympathetic and supportive of these groups, and then there is others who perhaps are more engaged in the activities and the criminal activities, now terror activities that some of these groups support and engage in, and so it's also in the for laying of criminal charges and all of the other means that we can use to deal with these individuals and these organizations, that work of evidence and intelligence gathering continue. And I want to assure you that that's the work that we are very much engaged in.
Thank you. Operator, we'll go to our last question over the phone.
Thank you, merci. The last question is from Justin Ling, freelance. Please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. Good afternoon. Thanks for doing this. I'm wondering if I know we've been around this a couple times already, but I'm wondering if you can get a little more specific on exactly what the sort of maybe cocktail of intelligence and decision making that went into these groups specifically. The Proud Boys, for example, have never faced a terrorism charge, best we know, anywhere. This Russian group, as far as I'm aware, has no footprint in Canada. You mentioned earlier that, yes, there was some sort of fear or anxiety about the possibility of domestic violence from some of these groups. Does that mean that there was a specific plot that may have been disrupted or considered? Does it mean that you were relying on intelligence that may not have been made public yet in the court system, or are you in fact just relying mostly on open source intelligence that indicates these groups have participated in violence in the past?
Thank you, Justin. And as I know you're aware, our national security intelligence agencies and our law enforcement utilize evidence and intelligence gathered from a very wide variety of sources. I will tell you that without, as I've said, I'm not going to get into the specific elements of that evidence, except to tell you that there is a great deal of information that is available to us about the activities of a number of these groups going back a number of years. All of them have some influence in Canada. Some of them have a more strong presence in Canada, but their activities represent a risk to Canada and to Canadians around the world. As you know, we work very closely, as I've already said, with our Five Eyes partners. And so there is a great deal of information and intelligence that has been available and continues to be available. I think it's also important to acknowledge that the events in the United States in particular over the past several months, beginning in 2018 with violent demonstrations that took place in Portland and in Charlottesville and in Seattle, also provided with our intelligence and law enforcement agencies with a trove of new evidence. We've seen, obvious violent activity that took place on or around January 6th in the United States. And as disturbing and concerning as those images and those events were, they also provided law enforcement and our intelligence services with a trove of new information, which and quite frankly, many of these groups revealed themselves through those events that I've articulated and other events. Their intent and their escalation to violence became quite clear and evident, and we're acting on that evidence.
And as a follow-up, I'm sorry, I'm going to wedge two questions sort of into one here, but obviously under the criminal code, you have the ability to use intelligence that has not been made public and not been entered into the court system to make these decisions. Was any of that intelligence instrumental in this decision? Without going into the details of the intelligence, or are you using classified intelligence that's not been shared? And kind of further to that, maybe we'll just leave it there. Yeah.
And Justin, let me say that my responsibility is to examine the totality of evidence and intelligence that is available, and to determine its merit and its validity, and using all of that information that the national security intelligence organizations and our law enforcement are able to provide to determine whether or not it meets the threshold of reasonable and probable grounds for me to believe that this group meets the threshold as a terrorist entity. I then made sure that evidence and intelligence was also examined by the Department of Justice, and got a very strong legal opinion in support of my determination that it in fact did meet that legal threshold of reasonable and probable grounds. And therefore, then we've continued with the process of bringing that before Cabinet and for an order in council, which actually creates the entity. It is the totality of evidence from all sources that is considered in that determination.
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you all for joining us.